Any questions? No? Okay, so then can we skip down 2 slides, please? Okay, so many of you may already know, but we have a project website, and these 2 links will take you directly to it. Next slide, please. You can also get there from DLCD's main webpage, and that's what the top of it looks like. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see this column called Current Topics, and the first topic underneath it is Oregon Natural Hazards Risk Assessment Upgrade. And that link will take you directly to our page. That the order may change over time, but it'll still be there. Okay, next page, please. Okay, so on our webpage, this is what it looks like. It says Oregon Natural Hazards Risk Assessment Upgrade at the top. And again, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll see this table of meetings and other events. And this is where we are posting all the meeting materials. So, so you see the date of the meeting, you see a link to register. After the meeting, we'll put the recording and the meeting summary up, and also the presentation will go up after the meeting, but everything else will be there. This is the first one, but as you scroll down, we've started with this meeting, appending all of these meeting materials to the agenda. So it will say agenda and meeting materials, and it'll be a shorter list. So it'll be agenda, presentation, agenda and meeting materials, presentation, meeting summary, and recording. And so everything should be there. Any questions about that? Okay. So the next thing is I wanted to clarify a couple of things that we have, I think we have some confusion about as a group. And so the first thing I'd like to do is talk about the Declaration of Collaboration process. We've asked you to go back to your agencies or organizations and talk to people about it and read through it and see what it says. And if you have any comments, I want to make clear that we're not expecting the Declaration of Collaboration to be signed right away. And also that not all the workgroup member agencies or organizations will need to sign it. We need to get a little further into the process to know exactly what needs to go in there. First, we need to define the project, which is what we're starting to do right now. And we're already on meeting 3, and this is going to take a few more meetings over the next couple of months. And when we get there, then we'll begin discussions with the folks that we think we need to sign these declarations of collaboration with. The reason that we need it is because we need to be able to understand who can provide the assistance and what assistance they can provide to get us to the end of this project, to make sure that we come out with the project that we do it well and we do it on time, and that we fulfill our vision. And so once we have gotten there, then we'll develop the letters and then we'll sign. So it's going to be a process. It's going to take some time, and so just keep it to the side as we focus on the tool that we're trying to produce. Okay, next one, please. Oh, sorry, I just said all that. Okay, survey. I want to clarify, next slide, please. I want to clarify some things about the survey. We mentioned this last time, and I realized that we were rather vague and unclear about it. So we want to clarify. We want to solicit information from certain groups that we're going to need this information from for the risk assessment tool. So there are 3 groups. The end users that you can see are government agencies and graduate students in related disciplines, because they will become end users and they may have good feedback for us. Next slide, please. The other intended audiences are owners or operators of infrastructure, critical facilities, and lifelines. We need to know more about potential impacts of particular hazards on their facilities. And natural resource professionals, and natural resources includes not only farm and forest, but also things like estuaries, wetlands, dunes and beaches, threatened, sensitive, and endangered species, other wildlife and fish and other critters and habitats, and the whole ecosystems and ecosystem services. And so we're going to need to gather a lot more information about that because it's a weak part of our plan right now and it has not yet been included in the risk assessment. So our schedule, we don't know whether this is going to be 3, 2, or 1 survey. We're figuring that out right now. We may need to send a different survey to each of these intended audiences. But we're in the process of building that right now. The schedule that we envision for this is that we'll have a draft of the survey or surveys by the end of April or early May. Then we'll get some comments on it. We'll test it, we'll test it and finalize it, and then we'll distribute it in May. It'll be out for 2 to 3 weeks for responses, and then we'll analyze it at the end of June or July, and hopefully that will, or the beginning of July, I should say, and hopefully that will coincide with when we actually need to use that information. Maybe by then, we hope to be much farther along in our decision-making process. Okay, next slide, please. Are there any questions about the survey before we go on? No? Okay. So project description. We decided that there was some confusion about this too, and some people are more familiar with this than others. So we're going to back up a little bit and talk about a couple of things. So first, next slide, please, is the emergency management cycle. This cycle is, at the top, we have generally things that happen before a hazard event, and on the bottom, generally things that happen after a hazard event. So mitigation is reducing actions that we take to reduce impacts to populations, to infrastructure, to critical facilities, to lifelines, to communities before an event. So we look at what are the potential impacts and what can we do to address them. That's what we're focused on in this group. And then there's preparedness, which are actions that people and communities take to ensure their survival after a hazard event. And then I think we all know what response and recovery are. That's what happens after. The response is the immediate aftermath of the event when the first responders come and try to save people and restore order. And then recovery is when we try to build back. And so can anybody find the error in the diagram? Don't be afraid to try.
I would say that the arrows don't always just go in one direction.
Well, that's true, that mitigation can be part of response and recovery as well, and of preparedness, and the lines are gray. That's correct. That's not what I was after. It's a good point. Yes, thank you.
Joseph, he has his hand raised.
Oh, okay.
I took my hand down because I was going to say approximately the same thing.
Okay. Anyone else want to give it a shot?
I would say that preparedness and mitigation never stop happening.
Okay, that's true. That's not what I was after.
I would say that disaster could strike at any point of that process there before mitigation efforts or before you were prepared or during recovery efforts.
Okay, good. Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to, Marianne?
Oh, yeah, I was just thinking, does it assume that we are going to recover? I mean, one of the things that concerns me is the limited resources for recovery. So that was kind of what I was focusing on.
Okay, good question. All right. What I was thinking of was that the error in the diagram is the word disaster. The disaster strikes. Disaster doesn't really strike. Natural hazards occur, they happen, but they're not disasters until people and property are in their way or are impacted, and also when the environment is impacted adversely. So this was a point that Eric made in the last meeting, and I just thought I would bring it up again here, that it's only a disaster if there are impacts to property and people. Yes, Jeff.
So I agree with that, but the challenge is that a hazard is just a potential. So hazards don't do anything. Hazards are potential for something to happen, but by using a term like hazard event, we're making this opaque to anyone who's not in the profession. Hazard
Okay.
event doesn't mean anything to anyone outside of our field. I think that we're focusing so much on a disaster doesn't have to happen, but and in so doing are creating a barrier to potential users. I'm perfectly comfortable calling something a disaster and just recognizing this didn't have to happen. This is why it happened, but use plain English.
Okay. All right. Moving on. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is a diagram that we use quite regularly to explain where risk is. And so we identify it as the intersection of the hazard and the vulnerabilities, you know, what the hazard impacts. And that's where we assess risk. So are there questions about this or comments? Okay, so let's move on to the next one. So I wanted to go back and revisit here what exactly it is that we're doing. And that most of this is coming from the Declaration of Collaboration, that our vision is that the risk assessment will provide a strong foundation for strategically allocating natural hazards mitigation resources. And the charge, what we're going to do in our deliverables are that we want to create a public-facing, comprehensive risk assessment tool. So we're not doing a plan here. We're creating a thing or a widget. It's a tool. It's a model. It's a different kind of output than, you know, something we give input and it gives us output. Not something that we normally in planning do, as we're not creating a plan. We're creating a tool to give us data for a plan. And we'd like it to be in a geospatial environment. We want it to meet or exceed FEMA's requirements. We want it to incorporate climate change as an integral element of probability. We want to include socially vulnerable populations and underserved communities. We want to take an equity approach to this. Next slide, please. And we want to, as we talked about, I think the first meeting, add critical facilities to the ones that we already have. We're adding lifelines. We want to do a better job at historic and cultural resources and add ecosystem resources. We want it to be, of course, scientifically defensible. We'd like it to be scalable so it can be used at a city, county, regional, or state level. We want it to allow weighting of inputs. And again, we want it to be used by all levels of government. And we wanted to produce some results for use in the 2025 Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan update. Any questions about this? No, everybody understands? Okay. So moving along, I'm going to hand this over to Chris and we'll keep going.
Okay. Good afternoon. So in the diagram that you saw before, the risk diagram had two circles intersecting with each other. And that has been a traditional description of risk, but recently that diagram has changed a little bit to separate out exposure and vulnerability. It used to be just in one side of the equation of the Venn diagram. So now we have exposure, vulnerability, and hazard separated out, and it allows us to evaluate those elements separately and then combine them. And then very recently in the IPCC report for climate change, they added a fourth, I guess, propeller to this diagram, which is the response, the risk associated with the response to the risk. So for example, if your mitigation responses are to build dikes, then you have a risk that those would fail. So that response part of the diagram, it can't really be evaluated outside of your mitigation action planning, but it's an important part of the overall risk picture. So this is the model that we will be using in the natural hazard risk assessment. Any questions there? Sadie.
Chris, I'm going to raise my hand, and it's because, sorry, and my internet connection has been really unstable today. So if I start like breaking up or making my sound choppy, I'll turn off my camera. And apologies for being off camera. That's definitely the reason, so I can hear you all. But I did have a question, I think, on Marion's previous slide. So I apologize for asking us to step back for a moment. Can we go back in the slide presentation? So, not that far. Keep going forward. Yeah. So I'm thinking about the tool and this piece where it incorporates underserved communities, social vulnerability, climate change equity. If we are, and I think those are all part of FEMA's requirements, are we saying that the public facing tool, this GIS tool, incorporates that information as geospatial data, or that they are incorporated in the process of creating the public facing tool?
More than likely the first. More than likely it will be data that is available for users to use in their mitigation planning.
Okay, that is very helpful. That was my question. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so any questions about this modernized risk diagram? Okay. So with that in mind, I'm going to move into the discussion of some of the approaches to multi-hazard risk assessment. So there, the material that I'm going to cover today was printed out in the meeting materials. And if you'd like to follow along, you may find that a little easier to use than the screen here. So most of what I am presenting today was summarized from these two sources of information. One from the European, I can't remember the name of it, but anyway, it's a European document. Chapter 2 has a section about risk assessment methodologies. And this book, Environmental Hazards, Methodologies for Risk Assessment and Management, also in chapter 2 has a comprehensive review of risk assessment methodologies. And the latter book, the environmental hazards book, is particularly clear. It's well written. So I have provided links to both of these. They're both of them. The chapter 2s are available online. You don't have to buy the book. So yeah, take a look at those if you want to dive a little deeper into this information. So on the next slide,
Chris,
yes.
I'm sorry for interrupting.
Mhm.
But I forgot to mention when I was talking about the website that if you've already downloaded the meeting materials for today, we went in this morning and added Chris's notes to these slides. So the meeting materials are behind the agenda, and up till now, they've just been bigger pictures of the things you're going to see coming next. But this morning we added actually the note version of the slides so that you'll have all those notes with you. So if you've already downloaded it, please go download it again. And the links are in there. The links to those 2 books are in there.
Yep. Okay, so this is what the handout looks like. But before, actually, let's stay back in the first slide before I go there. So over the next coming weeks, we're going to ask you to weigh in on the design of the upgraded natural hazard risk assessment. And so this is why I'm providing this material, so that you'll have a basic vocabulary to work with. And at the last meeting, I introduced you to the FEMA National Risk Index, and we talked about some of the reasons why it doesn't suit our needs straight out of the box, although we might use some of the information contained within it. So today I'm going to go beyond that discussion of the National Risk Index and talk about some approaches that other jurisdictions have used nationally and in the United States, or internationally and in the United States. So at the end of my presentation, I'm going to ask you to engage in some critical thinking about the tools or the methods that I'm going to talk about. I'd also like you, like I said, to become familiar with the terminology and the methods used as described in these 2 resources, or in resources that you provide me as being even better than the ones I've come up with. I'd like you to think about other resources that you can provide, other methods or other approaches that we might investigate for our risk assessment. So we can go on now to the screenshot of the handout. Yeah, right there. So I'm going to start with these 3 methods. So but first I want to say that multi-hazard risk assessments are really challenging because different hazards differ in their nature, how you describe their return periods and their intensity. And so one of the first things we have to figure out in doing a multi-hazard risk assessment is to figure out how to normalize this data so it can be compared. And that's what a lot of these tools do. So I'm going to discuss all of them in the handout just very briefly, starting with narratives. So narratives are, of course, just a written description that qualitatively describe the hazard or its elements of risk. So narratives are used extensively in most natural hazard mitigation plans, and particularly in ours, where we describe a lot about the hazards. But that's kind of where it stops, is that's the narrative part. Ranking is another method that's used quite a lot, and I'm sure you're all familiar with ranking. It's like the ranking from least hazardous to most hazardous, or 10 best cities to live in, or 10 cities most at risk for natural disasters. So ranking can help us learn where to dig deeper, but it doesn't really provide us with comprehensive information that we can use to develop mitigation strategies. So I'm going to go on to the next slide and talk about matrices. So the matrix can use qualitative or quantitative data to compare two elements of risk. And in this case, likelihood of the hazard versus its consequences. So they can cover small and large areas. The values in the boxes are normalized normally from 1 to 9 or 10 or however many boxes you have in the matrix. They don't have to be a 5 by 5 matrix. They can be 2 by 2s or 3 by 3s. So they're pretty flexible, but they are limited by the fact that you can compare two things. The good thing about matrices is that we can combine quantitative and qualitative information in them. So for example, if you don't have quantitative information about consequences, you can use expert opinion and a ranking scale to come up with your scoring. One of the challenges with matrices, particularly if they're based on qualitative information, is that they do require quite a bit of stakeholder involvement because the scoring methods need to be vetted by users. They're very subjective. So the other thing is, like on some matrices, they divide the colored areas into acceptable risk or unacceptable risk. So the green areas would be acceptable risk, red areas unacceptable risk. And those dividing lines are also very subjective. What is acceptable to one person may not be acceptable to another. So they do require some thought and conversation with users about how we lay out the matrices. But they're very popular in natural hazard risk assessments because they're fairly easy to construct. All right, we can go on now to indexes. So indexes have gained popularity. They're popular because they can aggregate a lot of information into one number. And then that one number can be mapped very easily. Indexes are all known in the literature as indicator-based approaches, natural hazard risk assessment. They can combine different types of different elements of the risk equation, from social vulnerability, coping capacity, and different environmental situations. An index can contain a lot of information. That's an advantage, but also a disadvantage because they can hide that information behind that one number. And unless we provide ways to help users unpack those indexes, they can be limiting in helping users develop mitigation strategies. So we don't have to come up with one index, of course. We can have multiple indexes, and one of the benefits of using an index is that we can combine them so that we can have a suite of indexes that then we can combine into a larger index and so on. So they're quite flexible, but we do need to be mindful of hiding information behind a single number or scoring value. And then finally, the next one I want to talk about is, we can actually skip the next slide because it's just a blow up of the next one I want to talk about are curves. So curves are most appropriate when we have quantitative data. We have probabilities, we have depth damage functions, we have information that can be put onto a graph, and then we can use that graph to evaluate the intensity or the return period of a hazard and its consequences. So these curves require a lot of data, and for most hazards, we don't have that data. But there are some hazards for which we do have pretty good data, one of which is flood. The FEMA's HAZUS program uses an extensive use of damage curves to evaluate the cost of exposure, different levels of exposure. So curves can be really, really useful in developing quantitative risk assessments, but they're very data intensive, and we don't have a lot of the data necessary to construct them. Now, in FEMA's National Risk Index, they used kind of a curve in their expected annual loss number, but it's very crude. It only takes the value of the exposed elements and divides that by the, it takes the experienced losses and divides that by the value of the exposed elements. So it's very crude, and it's backwards looking. It doesn't help us look into the future. So although we don't have data for curves, we can create it with modeling. But again, that's a labor intensive process. But they can be really useful if you need quantitative data. All right. I know I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you. We're going to go for questions in just a minute. The last one I want to talk about as a method are event trees. And event trees are really useful for describing domino effects, follow-on effects, or concatenated hazards. They can be used to create adaptation pathway models or mitigation pathway models. Event trees are not used often in natural hazard mitigation plans because they take a lot of work to create. And there are a lot of assumptions that go into them, and not a lot of good solid data, but they can be useful for, like I said, thinking about cascading events. And in our risk assessment, the best example of using an event tree, although maybe not explicitly, is our tsunami modeling, where we have the tsunami, the flood, and then the damages caused by that flood. So that's a really quick overview of some of the techniques used to do natural hazard risk assessment. And in practice, most of the natural hazard risk assessments that I've looked at use a combination of these tools. None of them just use one single approach. So one of our challenges in developing our risk assessment is to decide intentionally on which tools to use under which circumstances, and then how to normalize them and combine them so that we have overall assessment of multi-hazard risk. So with that, I'm going to stop and ask if anyone has any questions, comments, concerns. No one? Okay, well, keep thinking about those questions, and I'm going to move on to the next slide, which we can skip that one. Very briefly talks about some of the ways that our current natural hazard risk assessment has used these tools. Like I mentioned earlier, we made extensive use of narrative descriptions of hazards and their consequences. We did make extensive use of ranking. And we did use, although we did not create our own social vulnerability index, we used the social vulnerability index from the CDC. So we did also, in parts of the risk assessment, use quantitative, or it's not actually on here, but we did use some quantitative data in terms of information that came out of HAZUS. And we did use qualitative data also in describing the effects of hazards on historic resources and other archaeological resources. So we used a combination of things. I'm hoping in this next risk assessment that our combinations can be intentional and richer. And that is one of the tasks that I want this work group to ponder on is how we best use these tools to create our geospatial risk assessment. Marion.
Chris, we also did some quantitative evaluation of the potential dollar loss.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So basically what we did was add up the value of properties that were exposed to any particular hazard and use that as our potential dollar loss that's required. Right. But what FEMA is really looking for now is not just, you know, the capital is worth this much money and the land it sits on. I can't remember if that was included or not, but whatever the total was, because it's exposed to flood. But they want to know, like, how much of the building is exposed to flood and what is the use of that part of the building and how much damage could how much damage could a flood of a certain magnitude create. So FEMA is really looking for much deeper analysis than we've done before quantitatively.
Right, or even qualitatively using major season indexes and so on.
Correct.
I mean, I don't want to discount that the value of qualitative data if we use them in intentional and systematic ways. So I'm quite anxious now to hear from you all about your impressions of these tools or suggestions for other tools or resources that I might look into as we build this inventory of potential approaches. Or if you have any questions or want to go back and look at any of these methods.
We're hoping for a lively discussion. We need your brains and your experience and your expertise here. This is where we're starting to make our decisions about how we're going to do things. So please speak up. Erica.
How does, I'm sorry if I missed this, but how does fixability come into this? So I mean, some things, not that money doesn't matter, but some things it's fixable, you just need a lot of money. Or it's fixable and you don't need a lot of money, but some things, no matter how much money you have, you can't really reverse the damage. Does that come into this at all?
That's a really great question. I could, if we're intentional about including it. I'm going to write that down as something that we should pay attention to. Thank you. Marianne, and then Vincent.
Yeah, the previous comment made me think about the impacts on mental health and like dislocation. We're in a housing crisis. People don't have very many housing options to begin with. And then if we have a hazard event or disaster, whatever you want to call it, people's perceptions, people's experiences of these events are exacerbated, right, by the lack of perceived control, the limited options they had to begin with, and now the options are even fewer. We have more people living in their cars, people are dislocated. In public health, there's more and more research around the power of social connections.
Yes.
And if those social connections are disrupted, how do we measure that or factor it in terms of our planning is, I guess, my question.
Yeah, so that power of social connections is a very important element, and it can be included in a risk assessment through an index. And it has been in other areas. So, yeah, thank you for that. Those are all good things to look into. And I think I do need to spend a little more time looking at the public health perspectives on disasters. Okay, Vincent.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, Marianne almost entirely anticipated my point. She stole a march on me, but that's good. You know, I think about this and the work we're doing at ODHS, and boy, we're going to be enthusiastic consumers of whatever model we create and whatever it produces in order to generate some investment justification for how we conduct a response and recovery. So also the inputs into the model, or if the model can take into account some of the demographic and social vulnerability indicators that Marianne was discussing. And also, you know, I please forgive me, I'm not expert in the modeling field, but you know, one of the concerns we have is around what functions that we attempt to provide as we prepare for disaster. One of those would be evacuation support, right? Providing some of the mass care capabilities in an evacuation support. And in some of our largest scenarios, right, that evacuation looks like west to east. And those are broad movements of people. And we're trying to get our heads around what are the realistic probabilities, how many people, what are the demographics of movement away from a disaster space? And then how do we utilize, like, how can we develop some data so that we can make some good decisions about the application of limited resources?
Yep. Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Jeff. You're on mute.
There we go.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of good information in there. I certainly think a multiple, whether we specifically use indices or not relying on a single tool certainly seems best, regardless of what we use, you know, individual or combination. I think you really hit an important point on it. They're all going to be based on a set of assumptions, and I think the more time and effort we put into validating those assumptions and coming up with a way for progressively evaluating them as time goes on, just as, you know, possibly looking back, how valid were the assumptions for the last batch? I think that's a big piece of the overall validity of the tool. I think another big piece of that is determining the baseline, particularly when you're looking at, I mean, built environment's relatively easy. Non-built environment is really difficult, but if you haven't landed on where we actually are today, hey, if people don't have regular everyday access to healthcare, social services, et cetera, disasters aren't going to suddenly make it better. So figuring out how that factors in. And last but not least, the qualitative versus quantitative. I think the more we get away from the built environment, the more we really have to go into qualitative analysis. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It just needs to be validated, particularly since most of the index-based tools pretty much stop at census tract or maybe census block level. And to make it meaningful on a more local basis, we have to go beyond that, which means more local and less standardized records.
Sorry, I'm writing that down. So thank you. Ariana.
Hi, so I was actually just going to kind of build off of what Jeff just ended on with the localized and regionalized data approach, especially in regards to the social vulnerability aspect, because SOVI and SBI, that data is great. It includes a lot of factors, which is really good. But in looking at social vulnerability, it's really important to look like at a very specific level. And so including as much local data, I mean, across the board in general, but especially for social vulnerability. So looking at things like, food stamps and WIC programs, daycare centers, these populations that might not be necessarily included in the national data set, but the data should be available in a lot of cases, can be really helpful.
So can I ask you a question about that?
Mhm.
As a tool, would it be helpful to provide a means for local governments or analysts to fill in that data and not specifically make it public facing, but for use for their own analysis?
That's the approach that I worked on a somewhat similar project in Texas, and that's what we were doing. We were working with all the jurisdictions to collect the data that they had, as well as providing data that we could provide them that they didn't have access to. And we were aiming it was public facing and free of charge, but we were aiming it more specifically towards the government officials and planners and emergency managers rather than like the general public. But we did have a system so that they could submit data or tell us that they needed to update data sets with kind of like regular check-ins along the way.
Yeah.
So it was more of like a living database.
Yeah. That's something we have in mind, and I'd like to talk with you more about how that might have been done. Because of course, when you have a public facing tool, you have to worry about privacy. And as you get smaller and smaller areas, that becomes more of an issue.
Yeah,
Or
and
lower population areas.
And even with some things like utility services as well, there's sometimes some privacy issues there too, but.
Yep. Great, thank you.
Of course.
Mara Kelly.
Hi there. I was noticing National Risk Index from FEMA was based on pre-COVID population location. So it made me think about a post-Katrina situation where a good number migrated to Houston or Austin, Texas area and never returned. So I'm not sure how this tool might tie into a sudden or dynamic changes of population locations that may not return or may not be able to for a long time. So why I'm asking this is for our courts, since we're looking at how we would approach a statewide response, we would need to shift based on how to quickly pivot or create. I mean, maybe City of Bend becomes the new Portland, things like that, how, sorry, Carrie, but just kind of keeping that in mind. So not sure where that fits in.
No, that's great. That's very helpful to add to the list of things to think about. Dan.
Yeah, one thing I've been thinking about through this is I've been tasked with kind of creating a kind of what are the upper bounds of a low probability, high severity event. So like another heat dome, and like, so thinking about the risk assessment in terms of it's the upper bounds of what's kind of possible, in particular on probability. Unfortunately, I have to do this project before we're done with the risk assessment tool, but just thinking about that, and what I come up with before then, I'll definitely add to or try to add.
That's really helpful. And I'm very anxious to see what you come up with. And one of the things I didn't talk about in my presentation was uncertainty. And in all of those tools that I presented, there are ways to address uncertainty. And I think that is something that we will have to consider carefully, because a lot of the information for a multi-hazard risk assessment is quite uncertain. And we don't want to give the impression that we know the answer, as it were. Jenny. Jenny?
Here we go. Sorry.
There we go. Okay.
I think I'd have a handle on this 3 years later. I just wanted to quickly throw out, while I'm very rusty in all areas of modeling, I know Jonathan Lockwood has done a lot of work around predictive modeling.
Mhm.
And some of his work may or may not be helpful in this process. He was actually one of my professors in grad school, and he focuses very specifically on predictive analysis,
Mhm.
although it's going to be qualitative rather than quantitative.
Yeah.
But his work is interesting and may or may not be another helpful tool as people are trying to figure this out.
Great. Thank you for that. I'll
You
look
bet.
that up. Jenny. Oh, no, you were just talking, right? Someone else just had their hand up. Did it go down? Gina?
Hi, it's Gianna.
Gianna.
Hi.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, how are you planning to use this tool to predict for communities who might be undocumented, such
Mhm.
as maybe migrant workers working in fields,
Mhm.
agriculture, especially with heat domes,
Mhm.
as well as anyone working in those sorts of labor-intensive industries who might be undocumented or have might not be represented in a lot of the census data. So I
Yes.
mean,
Good thing
obviously
to
that's a little
bring up.
difficult to maybe put in there, but I think it's something to consider.
Yep. Thank you for that. It's another area that we need to investigate. The other area that is not reflected in census data is tourism. And on the coast of Oregon, the number of tourists that use the area, I was going to say descend, but maybe that's not a very nice word, on the area are is significantly higher than the regular population, the year-round population. So those are that's another population class besides undocumented workers that are generally not addressed in natural hazard mitigation plans. And another part that's not generally addressed in natural hazard mitigation plans is how people move from work to home. So, and of course that'll change post-COVID. It's way different than it was pre-COVID. So that's just another population movement metric that we might want to think about how to incorporate.
Deanna, too. Oh, I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No, I was done. I was going to call on Eric.
Oh, okay. I was going to turn the question back to you and say, how do you have some suggestions for how to deal with those communities?
I mean, I think it would be really important to get their perspectives. I know there's a lot of advocacy groups, and I know OSU Extension has some partnerships with at least the labor-intensive forest industry that they're working, kind of getting more into the restoration and alternatives to logging and timber industry, but I can't speak on their behalf.
Mhm.
Say, you know, I mean, I know I went to the vulnerability assessment meeting in Woodburn, and some people had some really good points on that. And I think it's just having those opportunities to interface with people who those audiences. I don't know. Other than that, I can't really say.
Okay. All right. Just thought you might have some expertise or experience to provide. Thank you. Didn't mean to put you on the frying pan.
Eric.
Trying to figure out how to work this camera. Yeah, hey there, Chris. Just I have one point, but to respond to the undocumented workers, I think we have some information on the concentrations of undocumented workers through our occupational health program. But the point I wanted to make was that in reading through the 2020 risk assessment, particularly around heat events, I noticed that the counties that were called out as most likely to have a heat event are counties where the populations are most acclimated to heat. So when we saw that major heat dome hit, you know, it was the counties, you know, to the north, where we had the worst health outcomes, where acclimation was an issue. And so I'm just wondering if like that ability to acclimate applies to other, you know, natural hazards as
good
well.
point.
Like, you know, like, are there parts of the state where people are better prepared for wildfires? And so anyway, just
Or flood.
yeah, flood. Yeah, exactly. Like Tillamook, right? Where it
Yeah.
happens fairly frequently.
Great, thank you for that. Erica.
Yeah, I had three quick things. One is to the point that Eric was just making, possibly you could do something with anomalies. I don't know if that would solve, I don't think that would entirely address the point he was making, but sort of how much of an outlier is this event for the region. Another was, I don't know if there's a way to incorporate this. There very well may not be, but the notion that if people are displaced, you have the receiving community and there are stresses on the receiving community in addition to the wherever it is that you have the population that's displaced and then the population that's receiving the displaced, and there are stresses to both. And I don't know if there's enough information on that. And then this one, you can tell me to go fly a kite, but I'm wondering if sometimes it sounds like maybe what you're proposing is more of a method than a tool, and that's kind of a gray zone. But a tool, I feel like sometimes people have this idea that here, it's all nicely wrapped, do this, push this button and this button and this button and this button, and you get an answer and you don't really have to think about it. As opposed to here's a way to think through it. So you can just tell me to go fly a kite. That may not be relevant, but I don't know. It feels like there are a lot of tools out there and that sometimes tools get a bad rap and that you're not encouraging. The notion of a tool is less focused on getting people to think through a process, an evaluation process.
Yeah, that's important to keep in mind. As I mentioned in the construction of indexes, I am concerned that tools such as indexes do hide a lot, and they don't allow the users to explore potential mitigation options. So my intention in the risk assessment is to provide more of a think through platform rather than a tool that spits out a number.
Okay, before we move on to other folks who have their hands up, a couple of you have put comments in the chat, and we'd really like you to just keep participating in the conversation so that we don't have to focus on both the chat and the conversation. So I'd like to insert here for a moment Don Pettit, and then Gianna had a short follow-up to what she was saying. Putting you on the hot seat, Don.
Sure, I was just trying to say that an analogous process. One of the early comments was about incorporating the likelihood or degree of a success that some kind of a mitigation would have. And I was just kind of making the analogy that in the environmental cleanup process, there's risk assessment, there's investigation. Feasibility study is a big part of that, where you decide, how much is it going to cost? How much benefit are you going to get out of it? How long will it take to complete it? What's the likelihood of success? So, those are things that, could be worked into some of this. If a remedy is going to take, 50 years to put in place, and even though it's great, it might not be something that, you want to take on as a risk reduction, mitigative thing right now.
Yeah, Don, that speaks directly to my comment about the event trees and mitigation pathways. So thank you for that.
Okay, and Gianna, quickly.
Oh, I was just saying, I guess one number you could look at would be the H2 and H2B visas for temporary agriculture or forest workers. That's more of a tangible number that I was thinking might be beneficial to look at.
Okay, thanks. And Marianne, you did have your hand up. Did you put it down on purpose?
Oh, well, this conversation is just spurring all these thoughts. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm not going to share them all. But one thing.
Please do.
This is awesome. I love this stuff. So one thing, when you were talking about uncertainty, one of the things, my background's in risk communication, risk perception. And one of the things that helped with communicating uncertainty is to also communicate co-benefits from a mitigation activity. So even if this disaster doesn't happen, gee, we're improving air quality and your kids aren't having asthma attacks and ending up in the hospital, you know, and to quantify, in Washington State Department of Ecology quantified some of the air quality improvements, and the amount of money that was saved was just amazing. And that kind of convinced a lot of people too. It's like, well, so what if I don't believe in climate change, but we're going to improve the air quality and improve our kids' health? You know, so that was one thing. And then public health, we've developed relationships with different communities. And here in Lincoln County, we have a great relationship with an organization that serves mom speakers, Guatemalan immigrants, and they're fantastic to work with. So contact your local public health people for those connections if you want, including myself. And then the third quick thing is around tourists. There's a risk communication challenge. I grew up in Hawaii, and trying to talk to people about the ocean and how you need to respect the ocean. You know, and here too in Lincoln County, sneaker waves and such. Anywho, so yeah, I'm so glad you guys are addressing some of these thorny issues. Thank you so much.
Well, we're glad that you're here to help us do that.
Definitely.
Okay, sorry, now back to the lineup. Rhiannon.
I just wanted to also bring up something I remembered with the demographic data as well too. We've run into some issues with the 2020 census data in other places.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, just something to be aware of, that there might be some frustrations there. Wasn't the best rollout of that.
Yes. Yep.
Hey, Curtis.
Good afternoon. Yeah, and thanks everyone for this great discussion. My question is that as you're thinking about doing this methodology and looking at the hazards, are we thinking about evaluating the hazards based off of different time periods? So for example, doing evening versus day to be able to think about the impacts of folks being at work versus at home, or different seasonalities. Again, just trying to think about how we do that, and then being able to address here's and build that into our assumption in terms of here's what we would anticipate being a worst case scenario for this kind of an event. In general, recognizing that my opinion is at the state level, we're looking at this at a pretty broad overview, where we're going to try to get a lot more detailed at the county level. But if I'm mistaken, please feel free to correct me. Thank you.
Yeah, good thought on the temporal issues and seasonal issues. Yeah.
And Eric, I think you had your hand up too.
Yeah, I did. I'm a little concerned about getting too far into the weeds on heat events. But since I'm on it, might as well. So, you know, back in 2012, we worked with OCRI to come up with heat event levels by region. And unfortunately, the report never got published. But I was noticing, so we had broken the state up into 4 regions. And I noticed that the regions almost coincide, or, you know, I did with the 2020 natural hazards risk assessment. And so, you know, they would nest well within those. But anyway, you know, what it found was that, you know, we used Poisson regression with heat related illnesses, you know, and so we had established that, like, you know, a heat event along the coast is actually around 95 degrees for 3 consecutive days where we start seeing an increase in hospitalizations, and it's around 100 in the Portland metro region, but you know, it's as high as 115 degrees in Southwest Oregon, you know, when you get
Right.
around the Ashland, Medford area. So anyway, I think that those thresholds would work well this time around.
Thank you. We'll
And
see
I
if we
can,
can find that.
yeah, I'll dust off the report and send it to you.
Thank you. Maybe we can update it even, given the current, more current data.
Yeah, yeah, and we do have a new environmental epidemiologist that's onboarding that will be working on heat events, and they're coming on in May. So it would be nice to pick that study back up. It never did get published because our epidemiologist at the time had moved on.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Eric. I saw another hand up, but I don't see it anymore. Jeff.
It wasn't my hand, but what the hell?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So I just for what Eric said, I am not concerned about hammering too hard on heat events. You know, that's one of the big changes we've had over the last 5, 10, pick your interval years, and it's going to be more significant going forward. And it is, we already know that it strongly disproportionately affects certain groups of people. I also really like the idea of regional thresholds, and I don't think that approach should be unique to heat. I mean, I think we could apply that to many hazards. We could relook at, you know, going away from, say, magnitude thresholds for earthquakes and more towards intensity for what's actually experienced, and recognizing that that's going to vary substantially by location.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Yes, and looking at things regionally can also help us overcome some of the perception of one size fits all. So yeah, if we can manage to do that in our GIS environment, that would be awesome.
As well as distinguishing between primary and secondary and even tertiary effects, where a
Yeah.
single hazard may affect multiple regions, but in different ways.
Yeah, that gets back to that event tree analysis and whether we have the resources to pull that off. Yep. All right. Anyone else have some thoughts they want to share about this? Mara.
Don't shoot me, but
No.
the military does tend to have a lot of great tools that are free because they've already been paid for. I don't know or have seen if there are any military partners on this call, but especially the National Guard may have things that we could beg, borrow, steal. I don't know. So
thank you.
Just putting that out there.
I'm all for big borrowing and stealing federal resources.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. And international ones too. The European Union has done a lot of work in multi-hazard risk assessment. And as you probably noticed, the resources I provided are both from Europe. Anyone else? Wow, this is a lot of great information to put into the hopper and see what we can, how we can use it. That's really helpful. Thank you. And what I heard is that the concept of adding that fourth propeller on our risk diagram to address the consequences of our mitigation actions. It is something that it was mentioned tangentially in several of your comments, so thank you. Yeah. All right, anything else? Okay, so if you all think of resources, run across something, or want to chat more about any of this, feel free to send them along to Marion or myself. We are, like we are in the scoping and information collecting stage now. So anything that you can send, even if it seems out there or a little unusual, let's look at it. Let's consider it. So, or if you run across a geographic information system that you really like, even if it's not particularly related to hazards, if you just like the interface or something about its usability, send that along too. We haven't talked very much about that yet, but we will. So that's something else that we're collecting information about. Okay.
Can we go back to the presentation, Ashley? Okay, next slide. And next slide. Do you want to go ahead, Chris?
Okay, you want me to continue on? Okay, so as I mentioned, I did provide 2 resources. They're both available on the internet without paying for anything. Both of these books have chapter 2s, which discuss risk assessment methodologies. The rest of the books are also interesting. I downloaded the one on the left, and the one on the right I have ordered to have in our library. So if you have other resources that you think would be helpful or illuminating, please send them along. And then your assignment is to think about risk assessments that you've done in your own organizations that can add to our national natural hazards risk assessment, or the methods used or could be adopted. So yeah, take a look at what you've already done and what information and methods might be suitable for inclusion in the natural hazard risk assessment.
And for the next meeting, we have we're trying to line up some folks to dig a little bit deeper into the weeds on what we have and what we want to have in terms of data. Okay, is there anybody here from the community at large who has not had an opportunity to comment and would like to? Okay, anybody else from the group who would like to comment before we go? Anything for the good of the order? Okay, then I guess we're done for today. We'll see you on the 28th. Thank you very much. We apologize for the Friday afternoon meeting. It's the best we could do this month. Schedules were really tight. So we'll try not to do that anymore. Oh, wait, there's another message in the chat. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Marianne. Okay. Thank you all very much. We'll see you next time, and read your chapters and come up with more good stuff for everyone.